The morning mist clung to the runways of Silver Point Naval Air Station like a shroud, wrapping the Pacific Northwest base in a gray embrace that muffled sound and softened the harsh edges of military precision. At 0530 hours, the fog was so thick you could barely see 20 feet in any direction, but that didn't stop the rhythm of naval aviation from beginning its daily dance. Somewhere in the distance, the throaty rumble of jet engines warming up mixed with the sharp bark of orders and the metallic clang of maintenance equipment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Most people would have found the combination of pre-dawn darkness and heavy fog disorienting, even dangerous. But Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been walking these runways since before most of the current squadron members had even enlisted. She moved through the mist with the confident stride of someone who knew every crack in the concrete, every building, every shortcut that could save precious minutes when seconds mattered. At barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, Sarah had to look up to meet the eyes of almost everyone she encountered. Her flight suit, regulation size small, still seemed to hang loose on her compact frame. When she walked past groups of pilots heading to their morning briefings, she looked more like someone's younger sister who'd borrowed military gear than a naval aviator with 8 years of active duty and more flight hours than pilots twice. Her age, the dismissive glances weren't new. Neither were the whispered comments about regulations and height requirements and whether certain people belonged in billion-dollar aircraft. Sarah had heard it all before, starting from her first day at flight school when her instructor had looked at her paperwork, then at her, then back at the paperwork with an expression that suggested someone in administration had made a clerical error. That was 12 years ago. Today, she was walking toward what might be her last official flight as a Navy pilot, carrying orders in her jacket pocket that would transfer her to a desk job in Virginia. Administrative duties, no more cockpit time, no more feeling the raw power of an F-18 Super Hornet responding to her touch. No more being exactly where she belonged, even if everyone else thought she didn't. Sarah reached Building 47, the nondescript concrete structure that housed the squadron's administrative offices. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh after the soft gray of the morning fog, and the air carried the familiar mixture of coffee, jet fuel, and that indefinable scent of military efficiency. She was early as always. The hallways were mostly empty except for a few junior officers nursing cups of coffee and looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Commander William Torres sat behind his desk reviewing the morning's flight assignments with the methodical attention of someone who'd been making life and death decisions for 23 years. His office walls were covered with photographs from various deployments, squadron patches, and commendations that told the story of a career built on competence and reliability. He was the kind of officer who inspired confidence through steady leadership rather than flashy heroics. When Sarah knocked on his doorframe, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. She stood in the doorway with perfect military bearing, her short stature somehow making her appear more rather than less formidable. There was something about the way she carried herself that suggested coiled energy, like a spring compressed and ready to release. "Lieutenant Chun," Torres said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Come in. Close the door." Sarah entered and took her seat, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't fidget or show any of the nervous energy that most junior officers displayed when called to the squadron commander's office. She simply waited, patient and alert, for whatever was coming. Torres picked up a manila folder from his desk and opened it. The papers inside were official correspondence, the kind with government letterheads and formal language that changed people's lives in clinical, bureaucratic terms. He'd read them 3 times already, hoping to find some loophole or alternative. That didn't exist. "I received your transfer orders this morning," he said without preamble. "Effective next month. You'll be reassigned to Naval Air Systems Command in Patuxent River. Administrative liaison position. Good career move, potentially. Steady hours, normal schedule. Chance to work on acquisition and development programs. Sarah nodded once. Her expression remained neutral, professional. But Torres had been around pilots long enough to recognize the subtle signs of disappointment. The slight tightening around her eyes. The way her jaw set just a fraction more firmly. The careful stillness that came from not wanting to reveal how much something hurt. Permission to speak freely, sir. Always, Jen, you know that. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone that Torres recognized as barely controlled frustration. Sir, my flight evaluations have been consistently above average. My safety record is spotless. I've completed 2 successful deployments, logged over 1,500 hours in type, and my proficiency scores are in the top 10% of the squadron. I'm being transferred because of politics, not performance. Torres leaned back in his chair. The conversation was playing out exactly as he'd expected, and he felt the familiar weight of being caught between institutional policies and personal convictions. Sarah Chun was one of the best pilots he'd ever served with, and they were losing her because of attitudes that belonged in the last century. Chun, you're preaching to the choir. Your performance isn't in question. Hell, your performance isn't even in the same galaxy as questionable. But there are forces at work here that are bigger than both of us. He pulled another document from the folder, this one bearing the seal of the Secretary of the Navy. The language was carefully neutral, full of phrases like operational efficiency and optimal utilization of personnel resources. But the message was clear. Sarah Chun was being moved out of active flight status because certain influential people believed she was a liability. There was an incident report filed after last month's training exercise. Torres continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone navigating sensitive territory. Nothing official, nothing that reflects poorly on your performance. But Captain Morrison from the Enterprise Battle Group made some observations about pilot safety during high-stress operations. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her knuckles went white where her hands were clasped. Captain Morrison. She remembered him from the joint training exercise, remembered the way he'd looked at her when she'd climbed out of her aircraft after a flawless aerial refueling drill. Not the look of someone evaluating a pilot's performance, but the look of someone who'd already decided that certain people didn't belong in certain places. What kind of observations, sir? Torres sighed and rubbed his temples. This was the part of command he hated most, having to relay the petty prejudices of senior officers as if they were legitimate concerns. Morrison expressed concern about whether pilots of limited physical stature could effectively handle emergency situations requiring significant physical strength. Specifically, he questioned whether you could successfully egress from a damaged aircraft or assist other pilots in emergency scenarios. The silence that followed was loaded with years of frustration, hundreds of perfect landings, countless hours of training, and the accumulated weight of having to prove herself over and over again to people who would never be satisfied with any amount of evidence. Sir, with respect, Captain Morrison has never flown with me. He's never observed my emergency procedures. He's making assumptions based on appearance rather than capability. I know that. You know that. Hell, probably Morrison knows that deep down. But he's got influence, and he's got people listening to him. The recommendation came down from the Pentagon level. Transfer you to a position where your skills can be utilized without the perceived risks of frontline flight operations. Torres stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where aircraft were being prepped for the day's missions. Sarah remained seated, processing the information with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective pilot. She was running scenarios, calculating options, trying to find some path that led back to the cockpit. Is there any appeal process? Any way to challenge this? Officially? Yes. Realistically? It would take months, maybe years, and it would put a target on your back that would follow you for the rest of your career. Even if you won, you'd always be the pilot who made waves, who couldn't accept command decisions gracefully. Sarah stood up, smoothing down her flight suit with automatic precision. The conversation was over, even though neither of them wanted it to be. In the military, sometimes the most important battles were the ones you couldn't fight, and the hardest. Orders were the ones that made perfect sense to everyone, except the people who had to follow them. When do I leave, sir? Officially, you have 2 weeks to complete the transition. But there's a farewell flight scheduled for Thursday, standard procedure for departing pilots. One last hop in the Hornet before you trade it in for a desk. A farewell flight. Sarah felt something twist in her chest at the phrase. It sounded so final, so definitive. Like closing a book she wasn't ready to finish reading. Thank you, sir. I appreciate everything you've done for me during my time here. Torres turned back from the window, and Sarah caught a glimpse of genuine regret in his expression. Command meant making decisions you didn't like for reasons you couldn't always explain to the people they affected most. Chun, for what it's worth, this squadron is losing one of its best pilots. That's not an opinion. That's a fact backed up by every metric we use to measure performance. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Sarah snapped to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Thank you, sir. Permission to be dismissed? Granted. And Chun, that farewell flight on Thursday? Make it count. After Sarah left, Torres sat alone in his office staring at the transfer orders. In 30 minutes, he'd have to brief the squadron on the day's training missions, pretending that everything was normal while one of his best pilots prepared to pack up her gear and disappear into the bureaucratic maze of Pentagon administration. He thought about the letter he'd written to the Bureau of Naval Personnel, strongly recommending Sarah for retention and promotion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It had been politely acknowledged and promptly ignored. He thought about the phone calls he'd made to colleagues at other commands, trying to find some alternative assignment that would keep her in the cockpit. They'd all given him the same response. Great pilot, but too much political heat right now. The military was supposed to be a meritocracy, but sometimes merit wasn't enough. Sometimes the best people got pushed aside because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what a warrior was supposed to look like. Torres had seen it happen before, and it never got easier to watch. Outside his window, the morning fog was starting to lift, revealing the stark beauty of the Pacific Northwest landscape. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still shrouded in mist. The runways stretched out like concrete rivers, leading to horizons that promised adventure and purpose for those brave enough to chase them. In 48 hours, Sarah Chun would take her final flight as a Navy pilot. Torres had a feeling it was going to be memorable. The squadron-ready room was a study in controlled chaos when Sarah entered for the morning briefing. Pilots sat in worn leather chairs arranged in rows facing a large screen, nursing cups of coffee and reviewing flight plans with the casual competence of people who routinely defied gravity for a living. The walls were covered with safety posters, emergency procedures, and photographs of squadron aircraft in various exotic locations around the world. Sarah took her usual seat in the third row, next to Lieutenant Mike Rodriguez, her wingman for the past 18 months. Rodriguez was everything Sarah wasn't, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of natural confidence that made commanding officers nod approvingly when he walked into a room. He was also one of the few pilots in the squadron who judged her by her flying rather than her appearance. "Morning, Pocket Rocket," he said, using the call sign that had started as gentle mockery and evolved into something approaching affection. "Ready for another day of proving physics wrong?" Sarah managed a small smile. Rodriguez's easy humor had gotten her through more difficult days than she cared to count. He had a gift for making the impossible seem routine and the routine seem impossible, depending on what the situation required. "Always ready, Tower," she replied, using his call sign in return. Rodriguez had earned the name during flight school when he'd somehow managed to land his aircraft on the wrong way at the wrong airport and still make it look intentional. The briefing room gradually filled with the rest of the squadron. 14 pilots in total, ranging from fresh-faced lieutenants who still got excited about every flight to seasoned veterans who approached flying with the methodical precision of people who'd learned that overconfidence could kill you faster than enemy fire. Lieutenant Commander Janet Park entered carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who'd been up since 400, reviewing weather reports and flight paths. As the squadron's operations officer, she was responsible for making sure that every training mission achieved its objectives without killing anyone in the process. It was a responsibility that showed in the careful way she planned every detail and the thorough way she briefed every contingency. "Good morning, people," Park said, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. "Today's exercise is air-to-air combat training in the restricted airspace over the Olympic Peninsula. We'll be running multi-aircraft engagements with aggressor squadrons from Nass Whidbey Island." She activated the large screen, which displayed a detailed map of the training area. Red and blue symbols marked the positions of friendly and enemy aircraft, creating a complex three-dimensional chess game that would play out at speeds approaching the sound barrier. Weather is marginal but acceptable. Cloud cover at 8,000 feet. Visibility 5 miles, winds from the northwest at 15 knots. Not ideal, but real combat doesn't wait for perfect weather. Sarah studied the mission parameters with the automatic analysis that had become second nature. Wind speed and direction would affect fuel consumption and weapons accuracy. Cloud cover would limit visual identification ranges. The restricted airspace boundaries meant precise navigation would be critical to avoid civilian air traffic. "Flight assignments," Park continued, reading from her tablet. "Rodriguez and Chun, your blue flight. Initial patrol sector Alpha 7 through Charlie 3. Henderson and Nakamura, your red flight, sector Delta 1 through Foxtrot 5. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering emergency procedures, communication protocols, and rules of engagement. It was the kind of thorough preparation that made the difference between successful training and preventable accidents. Every pilot took notes, asked clarifying questions, and mentally rehearsed their part in the complex aerial ballet. When the briefing ended, pilots began filtering out toward the flight line, gathering their gear and running through pre-flight checklists. Sarah lingered, pretending to review her notes while the room emptied. She wanted a few moments alone to process the reality that this would be one of her last times sitting in this chair, surrounded by these people, preparing for the kind of mission that had defined her adult life. Rodriguez waited for her, recognizing the signs of someone who needed a moment to think. He'd seen the same expression on pilots' faces before difficult deployments, before challenging missions, before any situation that required mental preparation for what lay ahead. "You okay, Pocket? You seem, I don't know, distracted today." Sarah looked up at him, this man who'd flown beside her through dozens of training missions, and never once made her feel like she had to prove she belonged there. She thought about telling him about the transfer orders, about the desk job waiting for her in Virginia, about the end of everything she'd worked for since she was 8 years old and first saw the Blue Angels perform at an air show. Instead, she stood up and shouldered her flight bag. "I'm fine, just thinking about the mission profile. Multi-aircraft engagements get complicated fast." Rodriguez nodded, accepting the deflection because that's what wingmen did. They backed each other up in the air and on the ground, providing support without asking uncomfortable questions. "Come on then." Let's go show those Whidbey Island boys what real pilots look like. The walk to the flight line took them through the heart of the Naval Air Station, past hangars where maintenance crews worked on aircraft with the focused intensity of surgeons. The morning fog had lifted enough to reveal the full scope of the facility. Rows of F-18 Super Hornets in various stages of preparation, fuel trucks moving between aircraft like worker ants, and the controlled chaos of people who made their living, keeping billion-dollar machines operational. Sarah's aircraft, Bureau number 168,472, sat in its assigned spot looking like a predator at rest. The F-18 Super Hornet was a marvel of engineering, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 1.8, and equipped with systems that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. It was also, at nearly 60 feet long and weighing over 30,000 pounds empty, a machine that demanded respect from everyone who flew it. The pre-flight inspection was a ritual Sarah had performed more than 1,000 times, but she approached it with the same methodical attention to detail as always. She walked around the aircraft, checking every surface, every connection, every system that would keep her alive when she left the ground. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about Thursday's farewell flight and what came after. Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, the squadron's senior maintenance chief, approached with a clipboard and the weathered look of someone who'd been keeping naval aircraft operational for 18 years. Santos had worked on Sarah's plane since the lieutenant's first day with the squadron, and she took personal pride in maintaining aircraft that never broke down at inconvenient moments. "Morning, Lieutenant. Your bird's ready to go. Fresh oil, full fuel, all systems green. I ran an extra diagnostic on the environmental control system after that minor glitch we had last week. Everything's operating within normal parameters." Sarah nodded, appreciating the extra attention to detail. Santos was the kind of maintenance chief who understood that a pilot's life depended on the quality of work done in the hangar, and she never let that responsibility rest lightly on her shoulders. "Thanks, Chief. Any issues I should know about?" "Negative. This bird's ready for whatever you want to throw at it. Just bring it back in one piece, like always." Sarah climbed the ladder to the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the familiar feeling of coming home. The cockpit was cramped, filled with displays and controls that would have overwhelmed civilian pilots, but felt as natural to her as breathing. She'd spent so many hours in similar cockpits that the switches and instruments seemed like extensions of her own nervous system. The startup sequence was a carefully choreographed dance of switches, buttons, and system checks. Engines spooled up with a rising whine that could be felt as much as heard. Hydraulic systems pressurized. Navigation computers aligned with GPS satellites. Radio equipment synchronized with air traffic control frequencies. Silver Point Tower, pocket rocket, requesting taxi clearance for training mission Alpha 77. Pocket rocket, Silver Point Tower, taxi runway 27. Wind 270 at 15 knots. Altimeter 2-9-9-7. You're cleared for takeoff in sequence. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began taxiing toward the runway, her aircraft following the yellow lines painted on the concrete with the precision of a dancer following choreography. Around her, other aircraft moved in their own carefully orchestrated patterns, the entire operation coordinated by air traffic controllers who managed the complex three-dimensional puzzle of military aviation. At the runway threshold, she performed her final checks: flight controls, engine parameters, warning lights, emergency systems. Everything green, everything ready. She aligned the aircraft with the runway center line and waited for clearance from the tower. Pocket rocket, you're cleared for takeoff. Wind 270 at 17 knots. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt 35,000 pounds of thrust push her back into her seat. The F-18 accelerated down the runway with the kind of raw power that never got old, no matter how many times you experienced it. At 150 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off, leaving the concrete and entering the element where she belonged. Climbing through the morning clouds, Sarah felt the familiar sense of freedom that came with leaving the ground behind. Up here, politics didn't matter. Height requirements were irrelevant. The only things that counted were skill, judgment, and the ability to make split-second decisions that kept you alive and brought you home. The training mission would last 2 hours, involving complex maneuvers against experienced adversary pilots who would test every aspect of her flying ability. It was exactly the kind of challenge she'd been preparing for her entire career, and one of the last she'd face as a Navy pilot. But for now, climbing through scattered clouds toward the training area, Sarah Chun allowed herself to simply enjoy the pure joy of flight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Today, she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was born to do. The restricted airspace over the Olympic Peninsula stretched out below her like a three-dimensional chessboard, where the pieces moved at nearly the speed of sound and the stakes were measured in pride, skill, and the kind of hard-earned respect that could only be won in aerial combat. Sarah leveled off at 25,000 feet, her F-18 Super Hornet cutting through the thin air with the grace of a predator in its natural element. "Tower, you still with me?" she called to Rodriguez, who was flying at tactical formation. 2 miles to her left. "Right here, pocket." "Scope is clear, but those Whidbey boys should be showing up any minute now." Sarah checked her radar display, which showed empty sky in all directions. The adversary squadron was out there somewhere, probably flying low to avoid detection, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. This was the chess match aspect of air combat: patience, positioning, and the ability to think 3 moves ahead while traveling at 600 miles per hour. The Olympic mountains rose beneath them like sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. It was beautiful country, the kind of landscape that reminded you why people fought to protect it. But beauty was a luxury that combat pilots learned to appreciate quickly and set aside completely when the situation demanded absolute focus. "Contact, bearing 030, distance 40 miles, low altitude," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of a hunter spotting his prey. Sarah turned her aircraft slightly and adjusted her radar settings, sweeping the sky in the direction Rodriguez had indicated. There, just at the edge of her detection range, 4 aircraft were climbing toward them in a formation that suggested careful planning and tactical sophistication. "I see them," classic pincer movement. Too high, too low, trying to bracket us between altitude layers. This was the kind of tactical problem that separated good pilots from great ones. The adversary had numerical superiority and position advantage. But Sarah and Rodriguez had altitude and the element of knowing they'd been detected. The next few minutes would determine who understood the geometry of aerial combat better. "Split tactics?" Rodriguez suggested. "You take the high pair, I'll drag the low ones into the mountains." Sarah considered the option while monitoring her fuel state and defensive systems. Split tactics were aggressive, requiring both pilots to engage multiple opponents simultaneously. It was also exactly the kind of bold maneuver that could win decisively or fail spectacularly, depending on execution. Negative, stay together. We use altitude advantage to pick off their high element first, then deal with the low pair. It was the conservative choice, the textbook response to being outnumbered. But textbook solutions worked because they'd been proven in real combat by pilots who'd faced life-and-death decisions rather than training scenarios. Sarah rolled her aircraft into a diving turn, bringing her nose down toward the approaching enemy formation. Rodriguez followed, maintaining tactical spacing while both pilots prepared for the complex dance of modern air combat. At these speeds, with these weapon systems, engagements were measured in seconds rather than minutes. "Fox 3, Rodriguez called. indicating a simulated missile launch against the lead adversary aircraft. The engagement dissolved into a whirling three-dimensional ballet as 8 aircraft maneuvered for position in the thin air above the Olympic Peninsula. Sarah found herself locked in a turning fight with an experienced adversary pilot who matched her move for move, both aircraft pulling G-forces that would have rendered civilian pilots unconscious. She pulled her aircraft into a climbing spiral, using her superior thrust-to-weight ratio to force the engagement into a vertical plane, where her smaller size actually became an advantage. The F-18 responded to her inputs like a living thing, dancing through the sky with a grace that belied its 30-ton weight. "Pocket, you've got another one coming up from below, 12 o'clock low." Rodriguez's warning came just as Sarah's threat warning system began screaming, indicating that an enemy aircraft had achieved a missile lock. This was the moment that separated simulation from reality, training from combat. In a real engagement, that missile lock would mean incoming ordnance traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. Even in training, it meant someone had outmaneuvered her badly enough to achieve a killing position. Sarah rolled hard left and pulled the aircraft into a dive that used the mountains themselves as defensive terrain. She was flying at speeds and altitudes that would have terrified her instructors at flight school, threading between peaks with margins measured in feet rather than miles. Behind her, the adversary pilot tried to follow but lacked either the skill or the nerve to match her mountain flying. "Pocket, where the hell are you?" Rodriguez's voice carried a note of concern. "I lost sight after you went into the peaks." Sarah was flying through a valley that didn't appear on any civilian aviation chart, following a riverbed at 500 feet above ground level and nearly 600 miles per hour. It was the kind of flying that required absolute faith in your aircraft and complete confidence in your own abilities. One small mistake would turn 30 tons of fighter aircraft into a very expensive crater. "Still here, tower, just taking the scenic route." She pulled the F-18 into a climbing turn that used the valley walls to mask her approach, emerging from the mountains directly behind the aircraft that had been pursuing her. The reversal was so complete that her former adversary became her target in the space of 30 seconds. "Fox 2, she called, simulating a heat-seeking missile shot that would have ended the engagement in reality. "Good kill, Pocket," came the acknowledgement from the Whidbey Island pilot, his voice carrying the rueful respect of someone who'd just been outflown by a superior pilot. The remainder of the training mission played out with the kind of tactical complexity that made naval aviation both intellectually challenging and professionally satisfying. Sarah and Rodriguez worked as a team, using their communications, coordination to overcome numerical disadvantage through superior tactics and execution. When the exercise ended 40 minutes later, all 8 aircraft were heading back to their respective bases with valuable lessons learned and egos appropriately adjusted. The Whidbey Island Squadron had gotten a reminder that Silver Point pilots weren't to be underestimated. Sarah's squadron had gotten confirmation that their tactics and training were producing results. "Outstanding flying today, Pocket," Rodriguez said as they began their descent toward home. "That mountain flying was either brilliant or completely insane. I'm still trying to decide which." Sarah smiled inside her oxygen mask. The flying had been aggressive, even by her standards, but it had also been perfectly controlled. Every maneuver had been calculated, every risk assessed and accepted based on her knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities and her own skills. Little bit of both, probably. Sometimes you have to take chances to create opportunities. As they approached Silver Point Naval Air Station, Sarah found herself looking at the familiar buildings and runways with different eyes. In 2 days, she'd be flying her farewell flight over this same terrain. After that, her connection to this place would become memory rather than daily experience. The landing was routine, a smooth touchdown followed by taxi back to the parking area where maintenance crews waited to service the aircraft for the next mission. Sarah shut down the engines and began the post-flight checklist, securing systems with the same methodical attention she'd shown during startup. Senior Chief Santos was waiting when she climbed down from the cockpit, clipboard in hand and the satisfied expression of someone whose aircraft had performed flawlessly under demanding conditions. How'd she handle, Lieutenant? Perfect, as always. Chief, no discrepancies, all systems normal. She's ready for the next pilot. Santos made notes on her clipboard, but Sarah caught something in the older woman's expression that suggested she knew about the transfer orders. News traveled fast on a naval air station, especially news that affected people who'd served together for years. Ma'am, if I may say so, whoever gets this aircraft next is lucky to inherit it from someone who knows how to treat machinery right. It was the closest thing to a farewell that military protocol would allow between an officer and an enlisted sailor, but Sarah understood the sentiment behind the carefully chosen words. Santos was acknowledging that they might not have many more opportunities to work together. Thank you, Chief. It's been a privilege flying aircraft you've maintained. Rodriguez appeared at Sarah's elbow, having completed his own post-flight routine. He'd caught the undercurrent of the conversation and was looking between the two women with the expression of someone who suspected he was missing something important. Everything okay over here? You two look like you're planning a wake or something. Sarah and Santos exchanged a glance that confirmed they were both thinking about endings and transitions, and the way military careers sometimes took unexpected turns. But neither was ready to discuss those subjects in the open hangar, where conversations could be overheard and interpreted. Just talking about aircraft maintenance tower, nothing that would interest a pilot who thinks planes fix themselves. Rodriguez accepted the deflection with good humor, recognizing that some conversations weren't meant for him. He'd learned long ago that successful wingmen knew when to ask questions and when to simply be available if needed. Well, if you're done discussing the mysteries of hydraulic fluid, the debrief starts in 10 minutes. Commander Park wants to review today's engagement while it's still fresh in everyone's mind. The debrief was held in the same ready room where the morning briefing had taken place, but the atmosphere was different now. Pilots sat with the loose-limbed relaxation of people who just completed challenging work successfully, their earlier tension replaced by the satisfaction that came from performing well under pressure. Commander Park stood at the front of the room with a tablet displaying radar tracks from the morning's engagement, ready to analyze every aspect of the mission with the thoroughness that separated professional military aviation from recreational flying. Outstanding work today, people. The Whidbey Island Squadron reported that our tactics were innovative and our execution was flawless. Specifically, they were impressed with the mountain flying demonstration that turned a defensive situation into an offensive advantage. Sarah felt the attention of the room focus on her, but she kept her expression neutral. Military debriefs were about learning, not individual recognition, and she'd been taught long ago that successful pilots shared credit generously and accepted criticism gracefully. Lieutenant Chun, Park continued, walk us through your decision to use terrain masking for defensive maneuvering. That's not a standard tactic, and some people might consider it unnecessarily risky. Sarah stood up, her short stature requiring her to speak slightly louder to be heard in the back of the room. She was comfortable briefing groups, having done it hundreds of times during her career, but today felt different somehow, more final. Ma'am, the adversary had achieved a missile lock, which in a real engagement would have required immediate defensive action. Standard evasive maneuvers would have been predictable and potentially ineffective against an experienced pilot. Using the terrain created multiple opportunities, breaking the lock, reversing the tactical situation, and achieving a favorable firing position. What about the risk factors? You were flying very low, very fast, in mountainous terrain with limited escape routes. It was a fair question, the kind that required honest assessment of risk versus reward. Sarah had been trained to think about these calculations automatically, weighing survival against mission accomplishment in the split seconds available for decision-making. Ma single quotes am. The risk was significant, but manageable given aircraft performance, pilot familiarity with the terrain, and weather conditions. The alternative was accepting a simulated shoot-down, which would have been tactically unacceptable. Park nodded, satisfied with the reasoning behind the decision. This was how military aviation improved, by analyzing successful innovations and incorporating them into training for future scenarios. The point is well taken. Sometimes creative tactics are necessary to overcome disadvantageous situations. The key is making sure the risk is calculated rather than reckless. The debrief continued for another 20 minutes, covering fuel consumption, communications procedures, and lessons learned from the morning's engagement. It was the kind of thorough analysis that made the difference between good squadrons and exceptional ones, the willingness to examine every detail in search of improvements. When the meeting ended, pilots began filtering out toward lunch. Their conversation focused on the afternoon's training schedule and weekend liberty plans. Sarah gathered her notes and prepared to leave, but Commander Park's voice stopped her. At the door, "Lieutenant Chun, could I see you for a moment?" Sarah returned to the front of the room where Park was organizing her papers with the precise movements of someone who valued order and efficiency. The commander was in her late 30s, a career pilot who'd successfully navigated the challenges of being a woman in naval aviation and emerged as a respected leader. That was exceptional flying today, risky but exceptional. The kind of innovation that wins real engagements. "Thank you, ma'am." Park set down her tablet and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "I heard about your transfer orders. I want you to know that I've submitted a letter to the Bureau of Naval Personnel strongly recommending that you be retained in flight status. Your performance speaks for itself." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest at the mention of support she hadn't expected. Military protocol made it difficult for officers to discuss personnel matters openly, but Park was finding a way to express her professional opinion within the bounds of regulations. "I appreciate that, ma'am. More than I can express." Chun. In 15 years of naval aviation, I've flown with a lot of pilots. Some were good, some were adequate, and a few were exceptional. You fall into the last category, and losing pilots like you makes the entire Navy weaker. There was frustration in Park's voice, the kind that came from watching political considerations override professional judgment. She'd seen too many good officers pushed aside for reasons that had nothing to do with their ability to do the job. "The system isn't perfect," Park continued. "Sometimes good people get caught up in policy decisions that don't reflect their value to the service. But that doesn't diminish what you've accomplished or what you're capable of accomplishing." Sarah nodded, understanding that Park was offering both professional validation and personal encouragement. In a career field where criticism was common and praise was rare, such recognition carried special weight. "Ma'am, it's been an honor serving in this squadron. Working for officers like you has made me a better pilot and a better naval officer. The honor has been mutual. And Chun, Thursday's farewell flight, make it memorable." Walking back to her quarters, Sarah thought about Commander Park's words and the morning's mission. The flying had been exceptional, even by her own standards. The kind of performance that reminded her why she'd chosen naval aviation, despite all the obstacles and discouragement. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, Pacific Northwest clarity that made everything seem more vivid, more immediate. The fog that usually shrouded Silver Point Naval Air Station had lifted completely, revealing a landscape of sharp edges and brilliant colors under an impossibly blue sky. It was the kind of weather that made pilots grateful to be alive and reminded them why they'd chosen a profession that required them to dance with physics at 30,000 feet. Sarah Chun stood in her quarters, packing the last of her personal belongings into regulation cardboard boxes. 8 years of accumulated life reduced to 4 containers that would be shipped to her new assignment in Virginia. Books on aviation, theory, framed photographs from various deployments, a collection of squadron patches that told the story of her naval career in colorful cloth emblems. Her dress uniforms hung in the closet, freshly pressed and waiting for formal occasions that might never come. The flight suits that had been her daily uniform were folded precisely in her sea bag, though she wondered how often she'd wear them. In an administrative position, desk jobs had different requirements, different uniforms, different measures of success. The knock on her door came at exactly 0800, prompt and professional. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood in the hallway wearing his flight suit and carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from both in the cool morning air. His expression carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he knew wouldn't be welcome. "Morning, Pocket. Brought you some fuel for the day." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma that had begun countless mornings over the years. Navy coffee was legendary for its strength rather than its flavor, but it served its purpose of keeping pilots alert during long missions and early briefings. "Thanks, Tower. What's the word from operations?" Rodriguez took a sip of his coffee before answering, using the pause to choose his words carefully. He'd been dreading this conversation since hearing about the morning's developments, knowing that Sarah deserved to hear the news from a friend rather than through official channels. "There's been a change to today's flight schedule. Your farewell flight has been postponed indefinitely. Commander Torres wants to see you in his office." At 0830, Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. Postponed indefinitely was military language for canceled, and canceled farewell flights usually meant someone in the chain of command had decided that even ceremonial recognition was more than a departing pilot deserved. Did he say why? Negative. Just that there were new developments that required immediate attention. But Pocket, the timing feels off. Something's happening that we're not being told about. Sarah set down her coffee cup and reached for her flight jacket, muscle memory overriding the disappointment that threatened to overwhelm her analytical thinking. In naval aviation, you learn to compartmentalize emotions until there was time to process them properly. Right now, Commander Torres was waiting for her, and keeping a commanding officer waiting was never advisable. "Thanks for the heads-up, Tower. I'll see what this is about." Rodriguez watched her walk toward the door with the same economical stride that characterized everything she did, her short stature somehow making her appear more rather than less determined. He'd flown with enough pilots to recognize the signs of someone preparing for bad news, and he wished there was something he could do to change whatever was coming. The walk to Building 47 gave Sarah time to run through possible scenarios. Perhaps her transfer had been accelerated, requiring immediate departure. Maybe there were administrative details that needed attention before she could be released from duty. Or possibly someone had decided that farewell flights were an unnecessary expense for pilots being transferred to desk jobs. Commander Torres's office looked different in the morning light, the photographs and commendations on his walls seeming to carry extra weight. He was standing behind his desk when she knocked, his posture suggesting someone who'd been pacing and thinking for most of the night. The manila folders that usually contained routine paperwork were replaced by a single red classified document folder. "Lieutenant Chen, come in. Close the door and have a seat." Sarah entered and took her usual chair, noting that Torres looked like he'd been awake far longer than military schedule required. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes carried the fatigue that came from making difficult decisions under pressure. The red folder on his desk suggested that whatever was happening involved classified information. "Sir, Lieutenant Rodriguez mentioned that my farewell flight had been postponed." Torres picked up the red folder and held it for a moment without opening it, as if weighing the implications of what it contained. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone delivering information that would change everything. Chun, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Nothing leaves this room without specific authorization from the Pentagon. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Torres opened the folder and removed a series of photographs that looked like they'd been taken by high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The images showed mountainous terrain marked with grid coordinates and tactical symbols that indicated military significance. 48 hours ago, a Navy SEAL team conducting a classified reconnaissance mission in the Cascade Mountains encountered unexpected resistance. Their extraction helicopter was shot down by what intelligence believes to be a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system. Sarah studied the photographs while Torres continued his briefing, her pilot's eye automatically analyzing the terrain for approach routes, landing zones, and defensive positions. The mountains shown in the images were some of the most challenging flying territory in the Pacific Northwest, with unpredictable weather patterns and limited options for emergency landings. The SEAL team managed to reach the crash site and found one survivor, Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, the extraction helicopter's pilot. He's severely injured but alive. The problem is that he's trapped in terrain that conventional rescue aircraft can't reach. Torres pulled out another photograph, this one showing a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that rose nearly vertically. On both sides, at the bottom of the valley, barely visible in the image, was the wreckage of what had been a state-of-the-art military helicopter. The crash site is here, in a box canyon approximately 2 miles long and less than 200 feet wide at its narrowest point. Approach is complicated by surrounding peaks that reach over 8,000 feet, unpredictable wind patterns, and the continued presence of hostile forces in the area. Sarah was beginning to understand why her farewell flight had been canceled, and why she was being briefed on classified operations. The rescue scenario Torres was describing would require the kind of precision flying that most pilots couldn't attempt, much less execute successfully. Sir, what's the current status of rescue operations? 3 separate extraction attempts have failed. 2 Marine Corps helicopter crews and 1 Coast Guard team have declared the mission impossible given current weather conditions and terrain limitations. The survivor has been on the ground for 36 hours now, and his medical condition is deteriorating. Torres closed the red folder and looked directly at Sarah with an expression that suggested he was about to ask something he had no right to request. Chun, your mountain flying demonstration during Tuesday's training mission has been reviewed by people much higher in the chain of command than me. Specifically, it's been reviewed by the officers planning the rescue operation. Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see. Her aggressive tactics during the training exercise, the low altitude flying through mountain valleys, the precision maneuvering that had impressed the adversary pilots. Someone had been watching, and someone had drawn conclusions about her capabilities. They want me to attempt the rescue. They want to offer you the opportunity to volunteer for a mission that officially doesn't exist. If you accept, your transfer orders will be suspended pending completion of the operation. If you decline, you'll be on a transport to Virginia tomorrow morning with no questions asked and no negative notations in your personnel file. Torres stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for routine training missions. The contrast between normal operations and the crisis he was describing seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Chun, I need to be completely honest with you. This mission is beyond dangerous. It's the kind of operation that ends careers if it goes wrong and disappears from history if it goes right. The pilots who've already attempted it are some of them best in the Pacific Fleet, and they've all said it can't be done. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Torres was telling her. A classified rescue mission in impossible terrain, with a survivor whose life depended on someone being willing to attempt what others had declared impossible. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn her to naval aviation in the first place. Sir, What's the timeline? The weather window closes at 1600 hours today. After that, conditions in the mountains will be unsuitable for flying for at least 72 hours. The survivor doesn't have 72 hours. What aircraft would be available? Torres returned to his desk and pulled out another set of documents, these containing technical specifications and mission parameters that had been hastily assembled by operations planners working through the night. Modified HH-6 Seahawk with extended fuel capacity and enhanced navigation systems. The aircraft has been stripped of unnecessary equipment to reduce weight and improve performance at altitude. It's currently being prepped by our best maintenance crew. Sarah studied the specifications while her mind automatically began calculating approach angles, fuel consumption rates, and performance margins. The HH-6O was a capable aircraft, but the mission profile Torres was describing would push it to the absolute limits of its operational envelope. What about crew? That's your choice. You can fly solo or select any qualified personnel willing to volunteer. Keep in mind that additional crew weight reduces fuel capacity and performance margins. The decision crystallized in Sarah's mind. With the clarity that came from years of training and the kind of moral certainty that couldn't be taught in flight school. There was a pilot on the ground who needed help, and she had the skills to provide that help. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental responsibility. I'll need detailed topographical maps of the area, current weather forecasts, and communications protocols for coordinating with the ground team. Also, I want Senior Chief Santos personally supervising the aircraft preparation. Torres smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office, recognizing the tone of someone who'd made a decision and was already moving toward execution. Does that mean you're volunteering for this mission, Lieutenant? Yes, sir, but I want to fly solo. Additional crew weight would compromise performance margins, and if something goes wrong, there's no reason to risk more than one pilot. Torres made notes on his pad while Sarah continued planning aloud, her analytical mind automatically working through the challenges and solutions that would determine mission success or failure. I'll need 2 hours for mission planning and aircraft familiarization. Launch time should be 1330 hours to allow maximum time in the target area while maintaining fuel reserves for the return flight. Agreed. Anything else? Sarah thought about the implications of what she was accepting, a classified mission that could end her career or her life depending on how well she performed. But she also thought about Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, injured and trapped in terrain that others had declared impossible to reach. Sir, if this mission is successful, what happens to my transfer orders? Torres was quiet for a moment, recognizing the complexity of a question that involved politics, personnel policy, and the kind of bureaucratic considerations that often overwhelmed common sense. Honestly, I don't know. But I can tell you that successful completion of a mission like this tends to change people's perspectives about pilot capabilities and assignments. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. More importantly, it was the chance to prove that excellence mattered more than appearance, that capability mattered more than politics, that the sky really didn't care about anyone's preconceived notions about who belonged there. Thank you, sir. I'll be ready. After Sarah left his office, Torres sat alone contemplating the magnitude of what he'd just set in motion. He was sending one of his pilots on a mission that had already defeated multiple rescue attempts, betting everything on the skills of someone that others had judged unfit for flight duty. But Torres had seen Sarah fly, had watched her handle emergencies with the kind of calm competence that couldn't be faked or taught. If anyone could pull off the impossible, it was the pilot who'd spent her entire career proving that impossible was just another word for challenging. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of intensive preparation. Sarah studied topographical maps until she could visualize every ridge, every valley, every potential hazard in the target area. She reviewed weather forecasts that showed marginal conditions with the possibility of rapid deterioration. She memorized radio frequencies, call signs, and emergency procedures that might mean the difference between success and disaster. Senior Chief Santos worked with her maintenance crew to prepare the HH-6O Seahawk with the kind of attention to detail that went beyond regulation requirements. Every system was tested, every component verified, every possible failure point examined and secured. The aircraft that would carry Sarah into the Cascade Mountains represented the best efforts of people who understood that someone's life depended on their work. At 1300 hours, Sarah stood beside her aircraft running through final checks while Santos provided a comprehensive briefing on the modifications that had been made to optimize performance for the mission profile. Lieutenant, we've reduced fuel capacity slightly to install additional navigation equipment, but range should still be adequate for mission requirements. The enhanced GPS system provides precision approaching capability down to 1 meter accuracy, which should help with navigation in the canyon environment. Sarah nodded, appreciating the extra capability that might prove crucial during the most demanding portions of the flight. In mountainous terrain, with limited visual references and unpredictable weather, precise navigation could mean the difference between finding the crash site and becoming a casualty herself. What about communications equipment? Upgraded to military satellite capability with backup HF radio for emergency use. You'll have continuous contact with Silver Point operations and the SEAL team on the ground. The final briefing came from Commander Torres, who arrived at the aircraft carrying classified mission documents and wearing the expression of someone sending a pilot into harm's way. He'd done it before during deployments to hostile territories, but it never got easier to watch good people fly toward danger. Shun, latest intelligence indicates that hostile forces are still active in the area, but they appear to be withdrawing. The window for extraction is now or never. Weather is marginal, but acceptable, with conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly after 1600 hours. Sarah accepted the mission documents and secured them in her flight suit pocket, along with detailed maps and emergency procedures that had been prepared specifically for this operation. Everything that could be planned had been planned. Now, it was up to execution and the kind of judgment that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Sir, what's the status of the survivor? Conscious but weakening. The SEAL team has established a defensive perimeter around the crash site, but they're running low on medical supplies and ammunition. Time is critical. Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence she'd performed thousands of times before, but which felt different today because of the stakes involved. This wasn't training or routine transportation. This was a mission where failure meant that someone would die. The HH-6O Seahawk lifted off from Silver Point Naval Air Station at exactly 1330 hours, its rotor blades beating the air with the steady rhythm that had carried military aircrew into danger for decades. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of leaving the ground behind, but today it carried extra significance because she was flying toward a mission that would either validate everything she'd worked for or end her career in failure. The flight toward the Cascade Mountains took her over familiar terrain that looked different when viewed through the lens of an operational mission. The forests and valleys that had seemed peaceful during training flights now represented potential hazards, forced landing sites, and navigation checkpoints that might prove crucial during the return flight. Silver Point operations, Rescue 1 departing controlled airspace, proceeding to target area. Rescue 1, Silver Point operations, you are cleared to proceed. Weather update shows conditions remain marginal but acceptable. Wind in the target area is variable from 15 to 30 knots. Variable winds in mountainous terrain were one of the most dangerous conditions helicopter pilots could face, creating sudden downdrafts and turbulence that could slam aircraft into the ground without warning. Sarah adjusted her flight path. to approach the target area from the direction that would provide the best options for dealing with unexpected weather conditions. 30 minutes into the flight, the radio crackled with a new voice using the call sign of the SEAL team leader. On the ground. Rescue 1, this is Ground Team Actual. We have you on visual contact, bearing 270 from our position. Be advised we observed hostile movement in the area approximately 1 hour ago. Grid coordinates to follow. Sarah copied the coordinates and marked them on her map, noting that the hostile positions were close enough to the crash site to complicate the extraction significantly. Enemy forces with portable anti-aircraft weapons could turn a difficult rescue into an impossible one very quickly. Ground Team Actual, Rescue 1. What's the current status of the survivor? Conscious but declining. Multiple injuries including possible internal bleeding. Medical officer estimates we have less than 2 hours before his condition becomes critical. 2 hours. Sarah checked her fuel gauges and calculated flight times, determining that she had approximately 90 minutes in the target area before fuel considerations would force her to abort the mission. It would be enough time for one attempt, maybe two if everything went perfectly. The Cascade Mountains rose ahead of her like a wall of granite and snow, their peaks disappearing into low clouds that suggested weather conditions worse than forecast. Sarah climbed to 8,000 feet and began her approach to the target area, using GPS navigation to guide her toward terrain that 3 previous rescue attempts had found impenetrable. Rescue 1, Ground Team Actual. Recommend approach from the southeast. Wind conditions appear most favorable from that direction. Sarah acknowledged the recommendation and adjusted her heading, while studying the terrain ahead through her cockpit windows. The canyon where Lieutenant Commander Mitchell was trapped appeared as a narrow slash between towering peaks, barely visible until she was almost directly overhead. What she saw made her understand immediately why previous rescue attempts had failed. The canyon was even narrower than the photographs had suggested, with vertical walls that rose nearly 1,000 feet on both sides. The crash site was located at the far end of the canyon, surrounded by debris and positioned in a space that seemed too small for any aircraft larger than a drone. More challenging was the wind. Even at her current altitude, Sarah could see the evidence of severe turbulence in the form of snow being torn from the mountain peaks and clouds that formed and dissipated rapidly as air masses collided with the terrain. Down in the canyon, wind conditions would be unpredictable and potentially violent. Ground Team Actual, Rescue 1. I have visual on the target area. Beginning descent for approach evaluation. Sarah began a careful descent toward the mouth of the canyon, using her aircraft's enhanced navigation system to maintain precise positioning while dealing with increasingly turbulent air. The HH-60 bucked and twisted as it encountered the complex wind patterns created by the mountainous terrain, requiring constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. At 2,000 feet above the canyon floor, she could see the SEAL team positioned around the crash site, their positions marked by brief flashes of reflected sunlight from their signaling mirrors. The wreckage of the downed helicopter was clearly visible now, twisted metal scattered across a small clearing that looked impossibly tight for a landing approach. Rescue 1, Ground Team Actual. Survivor is conscious and aware of your presence. He's asking about extraction timeline. Sarah studied the landing zone while fighting the turbulence that threatened to slam her aircraft into the canyon walls. The space available for landing was barely larger than her rotor disc, with no margin for error and no opportunity for a second attempt if the first approach failed. This was the moment theoretical planning met practical reality, when all the training and preparation either proved adequate or fell short of what the situation demanded. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. Ground Team Actual, Rescue 1. Beginning approach to the landing zone. Recommend all personnel take cover due to rotor wash and debris. The descent into the canyon was like flying into a giant Wind tunnel filled with invisible obstacles. Sarah fought constant turbulence while threading her aircraft between walls of stone that seemed to reach out and grab at her rotor blades. Every few seconds, downdrafts would try to slam the helicopter into the ground, requiring immediate collective input to arrest the descent. At 500 feet above the crash site, she encountered the worst turbulence yet, a rolling wave of air that picked up the HH-60 and threw it sideways toward the canyon wall. Sarah fought the controls, using every technique she'd learned in thousands of hours of flight time to regain stable flight before the aircraft impacted the stone. Rescue 1, you're drifting toward the north wall, came the urgent warning from the ground team. Sarah could see the canyon wall approaching through her side window, gray stone rushing past close enough to touch. She applied opposite cyclic and increased power, trading altitude for lateral movement in a maneuver that brought her aircraft back toward the center of the canyon with barely 10 feet to spare. The approach continued with Sarah fighting for every foot of descent, using minimal power changes and precise control inputs to guide her aircraft toward a landing zone that seemed to shrink with every passing second. At 100 feet above the ground, the rotor wash began stirring up debris from the crash site, reducing visibility to near zero. Rescue 1, you're looking good, 50 feet and centered. Sarah was flying entirely on instruments now, using her altitude radar and GPS position to judge her descent rate while the windscreen filled with swirling dust and debris. This was test pilot flying, the kind of precision approach that required absolute faith in your instruments and complete control of your aircraft. At 20 feet above the ground, she began to feel the aircraft settle into the cushion of air compressed between her rotor disc and the terrain. The HH-60 became more stable as ground effect reduced the turbulence, but the landing zone was still impossibly small and surrounded by obstacles that could destroy the aircraft if she made even a minor error. 10 feet, looking good. 5 feet. Easy now. The helicopter touched down with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower, Sarah's experience allowing her to judge the touchdown precisely despite the challenging conditions. She immediately reduced power to minimize rotor wash while keeping the engines running for immediate takeoff if the situation deteriorated. Rescue 1 is on the ground. Get me that survivor now. The SEAL team moved with the efficiency of professionals who'd rehearsed this moment in their minds dozens of times. 4 men carried Lieutenant Commander Mitchell toward the aircraft on an improvised stretcher, while others maintained security around the perimeter. The injured pilot was conscious but clearly in serious condition, his flight suit torn and blood-stained. Loading Mitchell into the helicopter took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to Sarah as she monitored her engine instruments and watched for any sign of hostile activity. The canyon that had been difficult to enter would be even more challenging to exit, especially with the added weight of a passenger and the urgency of medical evacuation. Patient is secure, Rescue 1. You're clear for immediate departure. Sarah increased power and felt the HH-60 lift away from the ground, rising slowly out of the compressed air near the terrain and back into the turbulent environment of the canyon center. The ascent was more challenging than the descent because she was now flying a heavier aircraft with degraded performance, requiring more power and more precise control to maintain safe flight. At 300 feet above the canyon floor, disaster struck without warning. A sudden downdraft caught the helicopter and slammed it toward the ground with a force that Sarah felt through every rivet and bolt in the aircraft. The descent rate indicator showed a rate of descent that would result in ground impact in less than 5 seconds. Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive. She pulled maximum power from both engines while raising the collective to the stops, trading forward. Airspeed for lift in a maneuver that used every bit of the aircraft's performance capability. The HH-60 shuddered under the strain, its rotor blades biting into the thin mountain air with the desperation of a drowning swimmer reaching for the surface. The aircraft stopped its descent with less than 50 feet to spare, then began climbing. Again, as Sarah nursed it back toward stable flight. Behind her, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell remained unconscious, unaware of how close they'd both come to joining the wreckage scattered on the canyon floor. Rescue 1, Ground Team Actual. We observed your altitude excursion. Are you okay up there? Sarah checked her instruments and found everything within normal limits despite the violent maneuver she'd just performed. The HH-60 was built to handle extreme conditions, and her gentle treatment of the controls had kept the stress within acceptable parameters. Affirmative, ground team. Continuing climb to exit altitude. The remainder of the exit from the canyon tested every aspect of Sarah's flying skills as she guided the helicopter through terrain that seemed designed to destroy aircraft. Turbulence tried to throw her into the canyon walls, downdrafts attempted to slam her into the ground, and crosswinds worked to push her off course into areas where recovery would be impossible. But Sarah had spent years learning to fly in challenging conditions, and her experience served her well now. She anticipated each gust of wind, compensated for each downdraft, and threaded her aircraft through the canyon with the precision of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. 20 minutes after landing, the HHD Seahawk climbed, clear of the mountain peaks and into smooth air above the Cascade Range. Sarah felt the tension leave her shoulders as the aircraft settled into stable flight toward the medical facilities at Silver Point Naval Air Station. Silver Point Operations, Rescue 1 departing target area with survivor aboard. Request immediate medical assistance on arrival. Rescue 1, Silver Point Operations, outstanding work. Medical team is standing by for immediate transport to Naval Hospital. You've got clear weather all the way home. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to process what she'd just accomplished. She'd successfully completed a mission that multiple experienced pilots had declared impossible, using skills that others had judged inadequate for military aviation. More importantly, she'd brought home a fellow pilot who would have died without her intervention. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell stirred during the return flight, briefly regaining consciousness long enough to recognize that he was in an aircraft heading towards safety. He tried to speak, but Sarah motioned for him to conserve his strength. Just rest, sir. We're going home. The landing at Silver Point Naval Air Station was routine after the challenges of the mountain rescue, but the reception was anything but normal. Commander Torres stood near the landing pad with a medical team and an expression that mixed relief with professional pride. Senior Chief Santos waited nearby with her maintenance crew, ready to inspect an aircraft that had just completed one of the most demanding missions in the squadron's history. As the H-60 touched down and its rotors began to slow, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from completing difficult work successfully. She'd proven something important today, not just to others but to herself. The sky truly didn't care about anyone's opinions regarding who belonged there. It only responded to skill, courage, and the willingness to accept challenges that others avoided. Medical personnel rushed Lieutenant Commander Mitchell toward a waiting ambulance while Sarah completed her shutdown checklist with the same methodical attention she'd shown during startup. When she finally climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to find a small crowd of personnel waiting to congratulate her on the successful mission. Commander Torres approached with the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in a subordinate had been completely validated. Outstanding work, Lieutenant. That was flying of the highest caliber under impossible conditions. Thank you, sir. How's Lieutenant Commander Mitchell? Medical team says he's stable and should make a full recovery. Without your intervention, he wouldn't have lasted another hour. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility and the satisfaction of having met it successfully. This was why she'd become a naval aviator, to serve in situations where her skills could make the difference between life and death. Sir, What happens now regarding my transfer orders? Torres smiled and pulled a message from his pocket, this one bearing the letterhead of Naval Personnel Command. Your orders have been officially rescinded, pending a comprehensive review of your service record and current assignment. It seems that certain people in Washington are reconsidering their position on pilot assignments based on today's demonstration of capability. It wasn't a guarantee of permanent retention, but it was hope. More importantly, it was recognition that excellence mattered more than prejudice, that capability mattered more than appearance, and that the military was strongest when it judged people by their performance rather than their profile. Senior Chief Santos approached with her clipboard and the satisfied expression of someone whose aircraft had performed flawlessly under extreme conditions. Lieutenant, the bird came through without a scratch. Whatever you did up there, you did it right. This aircraft is ready for the next mission whenever you are. Sarah looked at the HH-60 Seahawk that had carried her through one of the most challenging flights of her career. The aircraft showed no signs of the stress it had endured, testament to both the skill of its maintenance crew and the careful way she'd handled it during the rescue operation. Thank you, Chief. It was an honor flying an aircraft you'd prepared. As the crowd gradually dispersed and normal base operations resumed, Sarah found herself standing alone on the flight line, thinking about the day's events. She'd proven that height was irrelevant when measured against skill, that prejudice was meaningless when confronted with performance, and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that nobody else would ever fully understand. The sun was setting over the Pacific Northwest, painting the mountains where she'd flown her rescue mission in shades of gold and purple. Somewhere in those peaks, a SEAL team was preparing to extract from a position they'd held for 3 days, their mission accomplished and their wounded comrades safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to demonstrate that excellence came in many forms. But today, Sarah Chun had touched the sky in the way that mattered most, using her skills to serve others and proving that the measure of a pilot had nothing to do with height and everything to do with heart. The rescue mission would become part of squadron legend, the story passed down to new pilots as an example of what was possible when skill met opportunity. But for Sarah, it was simply another day of doing what she'd been trained to do in the place where she'd always belonged, regardless of what anyone else thought about her right to be there. 3 weeks after the mountain rescue, Sarah Chun found herself in a conference room at the Pentagon, sitting across from a panel of senior naval officers whose collective experience represented decades of military aviation leadership. The room was sterile and windowless, illuminated by fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. Maps covered one wall, showing global deployment patterns and strategic locations where naval aviation played crucial roles in national defense. Vice Admiral Patricia Hawkins, a woman whose career had blazed trails for female naval aviators, sat at the center of the panel. Her uniform displayed ribbons and decorations that told the story of a career built on competence, courage, and the kind of leadership that inspired others to exceed their own expectations. She'd been following Sarah's case since the rescue mission, and the files spread before her contained evaluations, recommendations, and assessments that painted a picture of exceptional capability. Lieutenant Chun, Admiral Hawkins began her voice carrying the authority that came from commanding respect rather than demanding it. Your actions during the Cascade Mountains rescue operation have generated considerable discussion at the highest levels of naval leadership. The mission you completed was deemed impossible by multiple experienced pilots, yet you executed it flawlessly under conditions that would have challenged our most senior aviators. Sarah sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the professional composure that had served her throughout her career. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of debriefings, medical examinations, and interviews as various officials attempted to understand exactly what had happened in those mountains. and what it meant for naval aviation policy. Thank you. MAAM. I was fortunate to have excellent aircraft and outstanding support from ground personnel. Admiral Hawkins smiled slightly, recognizing the kind of humility that characterized the best military officers. Exceptional performers often deflected credit toward their teams and equipment, understanding that individual success was built on collective effort and institutional support. Lieutenant, humility is an admirable quality, but false modesty serves no one. The flying you demonstrated during that rescue required skills that cannot be taught in any flight school. You succeeded where others failed because you possess a combination of technical ability, tactical judgment, and courage that defines the very best of naval aviation. The other panel members nodded agreement, their expressions reflecting the kind of professional respect that was earned rather than given. Captain Robert Sterling, a carrier air group commander with over 4,000 flight hours, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd made career decisions based on pilot performance. Chun, we've reviewed your entire service record, including evaluations from instructors, commanding officers, and peers. The consistent theme is exceptional performance across every metric we use to measure pilot capability. Your safety record is spotless. Your proficiency scores are consistently in the top percentiles, and your leadership potential has been noted by every superior officer you've served under. Sarah listened carefully, understanding that this briefing was leading towards something significant. Pentagon conferences weren't convened to offer congratulations. They were held to make decisions that affected careers, policies, and the future direction of military aviation. Admiral Hawkins opened a thick folder and removed a document bearing official seals and classifications that indicated its importance within the naval hierarchy. Her expression became more serious as she prepared to address the real purpose of the meeting. Lieutenant, the rescue mission you completed has forced a comprehensive review of pilot assignment policies and standards. Specifically, it has raised questions about whether certain physical requirements accurately reflect the capabilities needed for modern naval aviation. The statement hung in the air with implications that Sarah recognized immediately. Her successful completion of a mission that others had found impossible had created a case study that challenged existing assumptions about pilot qualifications and suitability for various assignments. Ma'am, I've always understood that military standards exist for valid operational reasons. My goal has never been to challenge policy, but simply to serve to the best of my ability within existing parameters. Captain Sterling spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many talented officers limited by regulations that didn't reflect contemporary realities. Chun, the standards were established during an era when physical strength was more relevant to aircraft operation than it is today. Modern military aviation relies increasingly on technology, precision, and decision-making ability rather than raw physical capability. Your mountain rescue demonstrated that. Excellence in flying has little correlation with traditional physical metrics. Admiral Hawkins consulted her notes before continuing, her expression suggesting that the decisions being discussed had been debated extensively before Sarah's arrival. The Secretary of the Navy has authorized a pilot program, effective immediately, that will evaluate assignment decisions based on demonstrated performance rather than physical characteristics. You've been selected as the primary case study for this initiative. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of what this meeting represented. This wasn't just about her career or her specific situation. It was about changing policies that affected all naval aviators who'd been limited by standards that might not reflect actual job requirements. What would that involve, ma'am? You'll be assigned to test pilot school at Patuxent River, followed by a posting to the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center. Your mission will be to evaluate new aircraft systems, develop tactical procedures, and demonstrate that pilot effectiveness is determined by skill and judgment rather than physical characteristics. Test pilot school was among the most prestigious Assignments in naval aviation, typically reserved for officers with exceptional flying abilities and strong technical backgrounds. Graduates often went on to lead squadrons, command air wings, and shape the future development of military aircraft. Captain Sterling added details that highlighted the significance of what was being offered. Chun, this assignment will put you at the forefront of naval aviation development. You'll be flying experimental aircraft, testing new systems, and working with engineers to solve problems that affect fleet operations worldwide. It's challenging work that requires the kind of analytical thinking and flying precision you've already demonstrated. Sarah considered the implications while maintaining her professional composure. The assignment represented everything she'd hoped for when she first chose naval aviation: the opportunity to push boundaries, solve technical challenges, and contribute to capabilities that would benefit future generations of military pilots. Ma'am, I'm honored by the confidence you're placing in me. When would this assignment begin? Admiral Hawkins consulted a calendar before responding, her tone suggesting that the timeline had been carefully coordinated with other ongoing initiatives. You'll report to Patuxent River in 6 weeks for the beginning of the next test pilot school class. The program is 18 months long, followed by a 3-year assignment to operational test and evaluation duties. Your performance will be closely monitored as part of the broader policy review. The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on Sarah. She would be representing not just herself, but all pilots who'd faced limitations based on characteristics that might not reflect their actual capabilities. Success would open doors for others. Failure would reinforce existing prejudices. I understand the significance of this opportunity, ma'am. I won't disappoint the confidence you're placing in me. Chun, you've already proven that confidence is justified. The mountain rescue mission demonstrated capabilities that exceed what most pilots could achieve under similar circumstances. Now we're giving you the platform to show what else is possible. The meeting continued for another hour, covering administrative details, program objectives, and expectations for the pilot program. Sarah would be assigned a mentor, provided with additional technical training, and given access to resources that would maximize her chances of success in the demanding test pilot environment. When the formal briefing concluded, Admiral Hawkins asked Sarah to remain for a private conversation. The other panel members gathered their materials and departed, leaving the 2 women alone in the sterile conference room. Lieutenant, may I speak to you off the record? Of course, ma'am. Admiral Hawkins leaned back in her chair, her official bearing relaxing slightly as she shifted from formal commander to someone who'd navigated similar challenges during her own career. I've been fighting these battles for 30 years, Chun. When I started flying, women weren't allowed in combat roles. When that changed, there were people who said we couldn't handle the physical demands. When we proved we could, they found other reasons to limit our opportunities. Sarah listened intently, recognizing that she was receiving insights from someone who'd faced even greater obstacles during an era when female naval aviators were rare rather than merely uncommon. The truth is, every generation of pilots has to prove themselves worthy of the opportunities they're given. What's different about your situation is that you're challenging assumptions that affect how we evaluate all pilots, not just those who happen to be women or happen to be shorter than some arbitrary standard. Admiral Hawkins stood and walked to the wall map, pointing to locations around the world where naval aviation played critical roles in maintaining American interests and protecting allied nations. Naval aviation needs the best pilots we can get, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Your mountain rescue proved that excellence comes in many forms, and that our job as leaders is to recognize that excellence wherever we find it. The conversation continued as Admiral Hawkins shared stories from her own career, describing the challenges she'd faced and the strategies she'd used to overcome prejudice and limited expectations. It was mentorship of the highest order, passed from one generation of aviators to the next. Chun, test pilot school will be demanding in ways you can't imagine. Not just the flying, though that's challenging enough, but the constant scrutiny. From people who are waiting for you to fail so they can say the program was a mistake. I understand, ma'am. I've been dealing with that kind of scrutiny my entire career. I know you have, and that's exactly why you're the right person for this assignment. You've already proven you can excel under pressure while maintaining the professionalism that reflects well on naval aviation as a whole. When Sarah finally left the Pentagon, she carried with her a new set of orders, a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal advancement, and the understanding that her career had become something larger than individual achievement. She was now representing change itself, the possibility that military aviation could evolve beyond traditional limitations. The flight back to Silver Point Naval Air Station gave her time to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. 6 weeks from now, she'd be beginning the most challenging training program in naval aviation, surrounded by pilots who'd been selected for their exceptional abilities and potential for leadership. Lieutenant Rodriguez was waiting when she arrived. Back at the squadron, his expression mixing curiosity with the kind of concern that close friends showed when they suspected major changes were coming. "So, Pocket, how did your vacation to Washington go? You look like someone who's been making important decisions." Sarah smiled at his casual tone, appreciating the way Rodriguez could reduce complex situations to manageable proportions through humor and perspective. "Let's just say the farewell flight has been permanently canceled. I'll be staying in naval aviation for the foreseeable future." Rodriguez's face lit up with genuine pleasure, the expression of someone whose faith in institutional fairness had been validated by events. "Outstanding! I knew those pencil pushers would come to their senses eventually, so what's next? Back to regular flight operations?" Sarah considered how much she could reveal about her new assignment, without violating security protocols or creating unnecessary speculation within the squadron. "Actually, I'll be transferring to a new program in about 6 weeks. Test pilot training, followed by experimental aircraft development." Rodriguez's expression shifted from pleasure to something approaching awe as he processed the implications of what she'd just told him. Test pilot school was legendary within naval aviation, the kind of assignment that represented the pinnacle of flying careers. Test pilot school? Pocket, that's incredible. Do you know how few pilots get selected for that program? You're talking about flying aircraft that don't even have names yet, testing systems that will define the future of naval aviation. The enthusiasm in his voice reflected the genuine respect that pilots had for the test pilot community. These were the aviators who pushed boundaries, accepted risks, and developed capabilities that operational squadrons would rely on for decades to come. It's a significant opportunity and a significant responsibility. I'll be representing more than just myself in that program. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the weight that came with being selected for high-visibility assignments. He'd seen enough military careers to recognize when someone was being positioned for either exceptional success or spectacular failure, with very little middle ground between the two options. Well, if anyone can handle that kind of pressure, it's you. Hell, after what you did in those mountains, test flying probably seems like routine airline work. The remainder of Sarah's time at Silver Point passed quickly, filled with transition briefings, equipment transfers, and the kind of administrative tasks that marked the end of one assignment and the beginning of another. She attended farewell gatherings where squadron members expressed their respect for her achievements and their confidence in her future success. Commander Torres presented her with a squadron plaque during her final briefing, a tradition that honored departing pilots while acknowledging their contributions to unit effectiveness and morale. "Chun, this squadron has been stronger because of your service. You've set standards for professionalism and flying excellence that will influence Pilots long after you've moved on to bigger challenges. Senior Chief Santos organized a maintenance crew farewell that recognized the partnership between pilots and the personnel who kept aircraft operational. Santos had worked with hundreds of aviators during her career, but she'd rarely seen the kind of mutual respect that had developed between Sarah and her maintenance team. "Lieutenant, it's been an honor maintaining aircraft for someone who understands that good flying starts with good maintenance. The pilots who work with you in the future are lucky to inherit that understanding." The final flight from Silver Point Naval Air Station was conducted in an F-18 Super Hornet, a routine training mission that served as an unofficial farewell to the aircraft and environment, where Sarah had proven herself as a naval aviator. Rodriguez flew as her wingman, maintaining tactical formation as they conducted air-to-air maneuvers over the Pacific Northwest. "One last timer on the pattern pocket," Rodriguez called as they approached the initial break for landing. Sarah looked down at the base where she'd faced rejection, found acceptance, and ultimately proven that excellence transcended physical characteristics. The runways and hangars represented more than just military infrastructure. They embodied the dreams and aspirations of everyone who'd chosen to serve in naval aviation. "It's been a good tour, Tower. Thanks for being the best wingman a pilot could ask for." The landing was smooth and routine, but it marked the end of one chapter in Sarah's career and the beginning of another that would test her abilities in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she taxied clear of the runway for the final time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from an uncertain future to the opportunity of a lifetime. 6 weeks later, Sarah reported to the United States Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland, carrying sea bags that contained her personal belongings and a reputation that had preceded her arrival. The school occupied a sprawling complex of hangars, classrooms, and flight lines where the future of naval aviation was developed through careful testing and evaluation of new technologies. Her classmates represented the best pilots from across the naval aviation community: carrier pilots with combat experience, helicopter aviators with special operations backgrounds, and electronic warfare specialists who understood the complex relationship between aircraft and the electromagnetic spectrum. They were all exceptional in their own ways, selected for the program based on flying ability, technical knowledge, and leadership potential. The academic portion of Test Pilot School was more demanding than anything Sarah had experienced since her undergraduate engineering studies. Courses covered advanced aerodynamics, flight test methodology, statistical analysis, and technical writing at a level that required complete intellectual commitment. Students who'd excelled in operational flying found themselves struggling with mathematical concepts that seemed far removed from the practical aspects of aviation. Sarah's engineering background served her well during the classroom phases, but she quickly discovered that test flying required a fundamentally different approach to aviation than operational missions. Instead of following established procedures, test pilots had to develop new procedures while simultaneously evaluating whether aircraft systems performed as designed. Her first test flight came 3 months into the program, in a modified T-38 Talon equipped with experimental navigation systems that were being evaluated for potential fleet installation. The aircraft looked familiar from the outside, but the cockpit contained displays and controls that didn't exist in production models. "Chun, your mission today is to evaluate the new navigation system's accuracy during precision approach procedures," explained Commander Lisa Park, the instructor pilot who would monitor the flight from the ground. "We need to determine whether the system meets specifications for carrier approach capability." The flight profile required Sarah to conduct multiple approaches to Patuxent River's runway, using only the experimental navigation system for guidance, while recording precise data about its performance. It was methodical work that demanded absolute attention to detail and the ability to fly precisely while simultaneously operating unfamiliar equipment. The T-38 responded to her control inputs with the crisp authority she remembered from her training aircraft. But the experimental navigation system presented challenges that required constant adaptation. Display formats changed without warning. Control logic didn't always match her expectations, and system failures were programmed to occur at the most inconvenient moments. Test control, Test 7. Navigation system is showing intermittent signal. Lost during the final approach phase. Recommend we abort this run and reset for another attempt. Test 7. Test control. Copy the signal loss. Execute missed approach and return for another run. Data is good so far. Sarah executed the missed approach and configured the aircraft for another attempt, using the time between approaches to analyze what she'd observed and develop hypotheses about system performance. This was the intellectual challenge of test. Flying, not just operating aircraft, but understanding why they behaved as they did and how they could be improved. The flight continued for 2 hours, with Sarah conducting a series of approaches while systematically testing different aspects of the navigation system. Each approach provided data points that would contribute to engineering assessments of whether the system was ready for fleet installation. When she finally landed and completed her post-flight debrief, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from conducting work that would influence naval aviation for decades to come. The data she'd collected would help engineers refine the navigation system, improving its reliability and effectiveness for future operational use. Commander Park reviewed her performance with the thoroughness that characterized all test pilot training, analyzing not just what Sarah had accomplished but how she'd approach the challenges presented by unfamiliar systems and demanding flight profiles. Chun, excellent work today. Your approach to system evaluation was methodical and thorough. More importantly, you demonstrated the kind of adaptability that's essential for test flying. Equipment doesn't always behave as expected, and test pilots have to adjust their techniques accordingly. The praise was meaningful because it came from someone who'd spent years evaluating pilot performance in the demanding test environment. Commander Park had seen hundreds of aviators attempt to make the transition from operational flying to test work, and she understood the characteristics that separated successful test pilots from those who struggled with the program's demands. Sarah's performance during test pilot school continued to exceed expectations as she progressed through increasingly complex aircraft and systems. She flew experimental helicopters, evaluated new electronic warfare systems, and conducted tests that pushed aircraft to the edges of their performance envelopes. Each flight provided lessons that extended beyond the specific aircraft being tested. She learned to think like an engineer while maintaining the instincts of a pilot, to question assumptions while accepting calculated risks, and to communicate technical findings to audiences that ranged from fellow aviators to Pentagon officials who made acquisition decisions. The final phase of test pilot school involved an independent project where each student designed and conducted their own test program under minimal supervision. Sarah chose to evaluate how pilot anthropometry affected performance in tight cockpit environments, using data from her own flying experience to challenge assumptions about minimum size requirements for military aircraft. Her project involved flying multiple aircraft types while wearing sensors that measured her ability to reach controls, operate systems, and maintain situational awareness during demanding flight profiles. The data she collected provided objective evidence that smaller pilots could actually demonstrate advantages in certain flight environments, particularly those requiring precise control inputs in confined spaces. The project culminated in a presentation to school leadership and representatives from aircraft manufacturers who were interested in the implications for future cockpit design. Sarah's findings suggested that naval aviation had been overlooking potential advantages by focusing exclusively on accommodating larger pilots. "Lieutenant Chun," said Captain James Morrison, the test pilot school commandant, after her presentation, This work represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that makes our program valuable to naval aviation. You've challenged conventional wisdom with objective data, and your findings will influence aircraft design for years to come. The graduation ceremony for Test Pilot School was attended by senior officials who recognized the significance of the training program for maintaining America's technological advantage in military aviation. Sarah received her test pilot wings from Admiral Hawkins, who traveled from Washington to participate in the ceremony. Chun, you've exceeded every expectation we had when you were selected for this program. Your performance has validated the decision to evaluate pilots based on capability rather than physical characteristics, and your research has contributed to our understanding of human factors in aircraft design. The assignment that followed graduation took Sarah to the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, where she would spend the next 3 years evaluating new aircraft systems and developing tactical procedures for fleet use. Her office overlooked the same flight line where she'd first proven herself during test pilot school, but now she was responsible for shaping the future of naval aviation rather than simply participating in it. Her first project involved evaluating a new generation of unmanned aircraft that could operate from aircraft carriers, conducting missions that were too dangerous or too long duration for human pilots. The systems were technologically sophisticated, but required careful integration with existing carrier operations to be effective. Sarah's role was to develop procedures that would allow unmanned aircraft to operate safely alongside manned fighters, sharing the same airspace and deck operations without creating unacceptable risks. It was challenging work that required understanding both the capabilities of robotic systems and the limitations of human operators. The project took her back to aircraft carriers, where she worked with operational squadrons to test new procedures under realistic conditions. Standing on the flight deck of USS Gerald R. Ford, watching unmanned aircraft conduct autonomous landings, she reflected on how far naval aviation had evolved since she'd first dreamed of becoming a pilot. Her reputation as a test pilot opened doors that had been closed to her throughout her earlier career. Aircraft manufacturers sought her opinions on cockpit design. Pentagon officials consulted her about pilot training requirements. Academic institutions invited her to speak about human factors in aviation system development. But the most satisfying aspect of her new role was mentoring other pilots who faced challenges similar to those she'd overcome. When junior officers expressed doubt about their suitability for demanding assignments, Sarah could point to objective evidence that excellence came in many forms. Lieutenant Maria Santos, the daughter of Sarah's former maintenance chief, was one such pilot. Despite exceptional flying ability, Santos had been told that her small stature made her unsuitable for fighter aircraft. Sarah took her under wing, providing both technical mentoring and the kind of encouragement that came from someone who'd faced similar obstacles. "Lieutenant, the only limitations that matter are the ones imposed by physics and engineering. Everything else is opinion, and opinions can be changed by performance." Santos went on to graduate at the top of her fighter training class, later becoming the first pilot of her background to qualify for carrier operations in the F-35 Lightning II. Her success provided additional evidence that naval aviation was strongest when it judged pilots by their abilities rather than their appearance. 3 years after graduating from test pilot school, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned as the officer in charge of a new research program focused on human-machine integration in next-generation aircraft. The position carried significant responsibility and the opportunity to influence aviation development for decades to come. Her promotion ceremony was attended by many of the people who'd supported her throughout her career. Commander Torres, now a captain with his own air wing; Admiral Hawkins, who'd become Chief of Naval Operations; and Senior Chief Santos, who'd retired but remained connected to the naval aviation community. "Commander Chun," Admiral Hawkins said during the ceremony, your career represents the best of what's possible when we judge people by their performance rather than our preconceptions. You've not only excelled in every assignment, but you've also opened doors for others who will follow in your path. The new research program took Sarah to locations around the world, working with allies who were developing their own advanced aviation capabilities. She found herself briefing foreign military leaders, consulting with international aircraft manufacturers, and contributing to standards that would influence global aviation development. Her work contributed to aircraft designs that were more inclusive, more efficient, and more effective than previous generations. Cockpit layouts were optimized for pilots of various sizes rather than assuming one-size-fits-all solutions. Training programs were modified to focus on demonstrated capability rather than physical characteristics that might not correlate with performance. Most importantly, her career had proven that excellence in aviation was determined by skill, judgment, and dedication rather than height, gender, or any other characteristic that had historically limited opportunities. The rescue mission in the Fairview Cascade Mountains had been just the beginning of a journey that challenged assumptions and changed policies. On a clear morning 5 years after her mountain rescue, Commander Sarah Chun stood on the flight deck of an experimental aircraft carrier, watching as the latest generation of naval aircraft conducted operations that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Unmanned fighters launched and recovered autonomously. Human pilots worked seamlessly with artificial intelligence systems. Aircraft designed using her research operated with efficiency and effectiveness that exceeded all previous standards. She thought about the young girl who'd watched the Blue Angels perform at an air show and decided that flying was her destiny, despite everyone who'd suggested she was too small for such dreams. That girl had grown into a woman who'd not only achieved her dreams, but had also ensured that future generations would face fewer obstacles in pursuing their own. The sky above the aircraft carrier stretched endlessly in all directions, blue and limitless and full of possibilities for those brave enough to claim them. Sarah Chun had claimed her portion of that sky through skill, courage, and the unwillingness to accept that limitations imposed by others defined what she could achieve. Her story had become part of naval aviation history, not as an exception that proved the rule, but as evidence that the rule itself needed changing. She'd proven that the measure of a pilot had nothing to do with height and everything to do with heart, skill, and the determination to excel regardless of what others believed was possible. The aircraft continued their eternal dance above the Pacific Ocean, carrying pilots who would never know how much easier their paths had become because one small woman had refused to accept that size-determined capability. Some victories, Sarah reflected, were measured not in personal achievement, but in doors opened for others, barriers removed for future generations, and assumptions challenged by irrefutable performance. The wind across the carrier deck carried the sound of jet engines and the promise of flight, reminding her that the sky belonged to anyone skilled enough to claim it and brave enough to prove they deserved to be there. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.